Today, we will go beyond the biology and psychology of violence to examine the phenomenon of violence as a symbolic expression, a form of communication that reveals humanity's deepest existential and spiritual concerns. Violence, in this framing, is both a symptom and a symbol. It represents the collapse of meaning, love, and belonging, and at the same time testifies to the vitality of the life force that refuses to be extinguished. This paradox, violence as both death and distorted life, has preoccupied poets, philosophers, artists, theologians, and psychologists for centuries. French sociologist Pierre Bourdieu coined the phrase symbolic violence to describe how domination operates through cultural norms that are internalized and accepted as natural. Yet, beyond sociological structures, symbolic violence can also be understood as the human body's and psyche's language of distress, a way of speaking when ordinary language fails. German philosopher Ernst Cassirer observed that humanity lives within a symbolic universe, where all behavior, including violence, carries communicative significance. Human beings are wired for symbolism. Our brains and emotions constantly translate experience into signs and stories. The destructive act then points beyond itself to a psychological, social, or spiritual reality. When we treat violence as symbolic, we shift from asking what happened to what is being said. Violence thus becomes a form of tragic meaning-making, a signal that something essential in the human symbolic universe has been ruptured. The word violence derives from the Latin word vis, meaning force or vital energy. This etymology suggests that violence originates in the same energy that fuels life, but something has led to its deformation. I stated elsewhere that through symbolic logic, violence points to the fundamentals of healthy development, a longing for life that is so important as to give rise to violence when the thirst is unquenched. Violence, then, from this perspective, is a life impulse gone awry. The act of violence is a symbolic attempt to reassert vitality in a world experienced as dead, alien, or unloving. Austrian psychiatrist Viktor Frankl observed that human beings will risk everything, even their own lives, to preserve meaning. Violence, paradoxically, often makes symbolic sense where it makes no rational sense. We have spoken of the tension that Austrian psychoanalyst Sigmund Freud described between eros and thanatos, which he saw as discrete and opposing drives. However, we can extrapolate from his own writings that the death drive is in fact a misdirected life drive, a perversion of the desire to connect. German philosopher Friedrich Nietzsche also believed that his Dionysian impulse captured a dialectic between violence and creation, that they are twin expressions of the same ecstatic energy. Here, too, we can hypothesize that it is only when a culture loses its symbolic expressions of compassion and creativity that raw violence reemerges. We can consider why. American psychiatrist James Gilligan asserted that love is to the soul what oxygen is to the body. People who harm others or themselves often describe feelings of being dead inside. Violence then becomes a counterfeit version of vitality. When individuals or groups are denied love, respect, and belonging, the psyche resorts to symbolic substitution. Fear replaces respect, and violence replaces love. German author Max Müller expressed this succinctly. Eine Blume kann nicht blühen ohne Sonnenschein. Und ein Mensch kann nicht leben ohne Liebe. A flower cannot bloom without sunshine, and a human cannot live without love. In theological language, this is the condition of the fallen soul seeking to reclaim its lost relation to the divine. North African theologian Augustine of Hippo stated in his Confessions that sin, including violence, is amor inordinatus, or disordered love. The problem is not love of violence per se, but the misdirection of love, and violence symbolizes the soul's disorientation, or its attempt to recover its place through force rather than through grace. Modern psychology corroborates this ancient understanding through empirical studies. It shows that relational deprivation and symbolic exclusion, not mere material impoverishment, are the most consistent predictors of violence. This is why relative poverty, or the division of people into superior and inferior, is much more potent stimulant of violence than absolute poverty. Violence arises when symbolic alignment through belonging collapses, and when the self's longing for recognition goes unanswered. At the collective level, symbolic violence extends into social systems. Systems of domination and oppression reproduce themselves through language, education, and norms, determining what is thinkable and what is sayable. Violence here becomes internalized, and even rebellion becomes a symbolic echo of the very force it resists. This is what French sociologist Émile Durkheim showed in The Elementary Forms of the Religious Life. Ritual and sacred displays of violence can seem to reaffirm social cohesion, where chaotic aggression converts into shared meaning. French literary critic René Girard expanded this into the scapegoat mechanism, by which seeming communal unity is achieved through the symbolic expulsion of violence onto a designated victim. In this manner, violence is structurally communicative. It tells us where a society has failed to integrate meaning and belonging, so that violence conveys what words cannot: exclusion, humiliation, or desperate plea for recognition. In a society where powerlessness and exclusion are internalized, creating conditions where alienation becomes normalized, the soul revolts. The symbolic systems fail to provide dignity or participation, and behavioral violence emerges as an attempt to reassert identity and agency. Thus, violence becomes a semiotic or symbolic event, revealing where society's moral and relational fabric has been ruptured. It speaks of the unmet human need for justice, which is what love looks like in the public sphere. Turning the absence of connection into spectacle, pain, and protest, every act of violence, however it is conceptualized, communicates a revolt against the collapse of inclusion. Like spoken words, violent acts are shaped by culture, myths, and imagery, sometimes given expression through religion and art. Thus, unfortunately, despite religion and art being two of humanity's great meaning makers, both have been fertile grounds for violence, from the Crusades and Jihads to artistic glorifications of war and suffering. When faith turns fearful, it becomes fundamentalism. When art lacks compassion, it can anesthetize against cruelty. Yet, these domains hold immense potential for healing. Violence in these arenas is not proof of their failure, but of their power and the importance of meaning in human life. There may be no greater form of violence in society's restriction of human beings from realizing their full symbolic potential, the capacity for identity, meaning, and moral growth. Yet modern systems often condone and institutionalize such violence, rewarding competition, alienation, and inequality. Humanity, with its discontents, then justifies collective violence, such as war, even as it condemns individual acts of violence because of this contradiction. Violent offenders often perceive themselves as victims of an unjust system that punishes rather than rehabilitates. The symbolic and moral failures of the justice system reinforce the primitive morality that might makes right rather than nurturing empathy or accountability. In both moral and emotional terms, maturity means expanding the boundaries of the self. German-American psychoanalyst Erik Erikson mapped this as a lifelong journey, from basic trust to care for others. Justice expands as human understanding and connections deepen. Such moral evolution moves from mere rule-based legality toward principle-based compassion and fairness. Russian novelist Fyodor Dostoevsky likewise insisted that no one can judge another fully, since all share mutual responsibility for the human condition. Across religions, justice and love are inseparable. Tzedek and tzedakah in Judaism, loving kindness in Buddhism, neighborly love in Christianity, generosity in Islam, and unity in Hinduism, affirming that law is needed only where love fails. The arts can also become a transformative force that sublimates destructive energy into creative visions. Because love is at the center of life, its loss is expressed not only through the absence of creativity, but through violent means. But once we recognize the importance of this expression and what it signifies, we can allow for the resolution of our deepest psychic conflicts to elevate ourselves to our highest expressions of creativity and compassion, where violence in society is no longer necessary.